Fishing has been an essential feature of Cape Ann since long before English settlers came here in 1623. Nearly 400 years later, it could be considered the most significant element of her historical narrative. The purpose of this story is to look back at a key turning point of fishing life in Gloucester, the 1930s and 40s, when powered trawlers finally replaced the classic dory boat schooners that held sway off our coast for centuries. It is the story of the men who worked the waterfront as remembered from someone who witnessed and took part in these events as a young man. In the 1850s, young men immigrated to Gloucester from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, drawn by the lucrative fish market. In a few years, demand for laborers increased as 1,600 Gloucestermen left town to serve in the Civil War. The Canadians brought years of skill handed down from generations of forebears who worked the many North Atlantic fishing banks adjacent to their shore. But with the completion of transcontinental railroads and improvements of food preparation, Gloucester's fish-centric economy blossomed with opportunity. By the mid-1880s, Gloucester was a roaring boomtown. Its harbor, home to over 500 vessels that required a substantial fish-related infrastructure. There were 30 fish-curing establishments and 60 wholesale fish dealers. Ancillary businesses proliferated, creating everything from anchors to foghorns. To quote the great naval architect Thomas McManus, vessels were cheap to build, fishermen were abundantly available, safety issues were of little concern for the owners, and sadly, vessels and the crews that sailed them were considered expendable. Dory fishing had to be one of the most dangerous of all livelihoods. In 1879 alone, 249 men were lost in 29 vessels, half of which went down in a single storm in February.
In the 1920s, you were away 3 months. 3 months to the Grand Banks for a salt fish trip, and come in after 3 months and make $100, and find your wife with a grocery bill at the company store, which exceeded what you had shared on the vessel's trip. 3 months away from your family. 3 months without taking a shower. 3 months without any interaction with the outside world, confined aboard this vessel, to say nothing of the medical emergencies and so forth. There was no weather reporting. You left on a sunny day and a hurricane could be right behind you. That's what happened in the August gale of 1927. More men were lost in that storm than in any other calamity in the fishing industry in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, or in fact, even in Gloucester.
The work was relentless and the weather unpredictable. But a technological breakthrough was soon to come from Germany. Rudolf Diesel, studying thermodynamics, knew that steam engines wasted 90% of the energy available in its fuel. This led to his invention of an internal combustion crude oil engine. Locally, steam and gas engines had become frequent by the early 1920s. But it would take until later that decade for vastly improved diesel engines to find their way into Gloucester's fishing fleet. They would revolutionize the local industry and essentially end the age of sail. Along with the diesel, the outer trawl method of harvesting bottom fish and Clarence Birdseye's flash freezing process would all help establish Gloucester as the premier fishing port of the world. The 1930s and 40s should be considered the golden era, more pivotal a period than any other in the productive development of the fishing industry.
Every once in a while, somebody comes along that's a leader in their chosen field. That's what Ben Pine was. Ben Pine was a vessel manager, he was an outfitter, He operated a very successful company that took care of at least 30% of the fishing fleet in Gloucester. By that I mean the Nova Scotian Canadian people all gravitated to his wharf because he was one of them. He talked the same language. Ben Pine was a natural leader, and he was a businessman extraordinaire, and he knew the value of publicity and public relations, and he just was born to lead the Gloucester fisheries as far as the Nova Scotian Canadian maritime segment of the industry. His expertise was in the management business and in the publicity business. Who would ever think of sailing a vessel to the World's Fair, Chicago World's Fair, or sailing the vessel in the doldrums of the Depression to Washington, D.C. to meet President Roosevelt and promote the industry as a whole for all of New England, not just Gloucester, but for New England. He was a giant in his time. He was everything to the community. He was everything to the industry. He thought always of the big picture, and yet he could bring himself right down to the individual, be right with the ordinary man on the street. He was liked by everybody. People used to tell me, you can dress Ben Pine up in a Hart Schaffner and Marx suit, and he still looks like he came out of a fish hole. Well, translated, that means that even if you put a tuxedo on him, he identified with the ordinary man. He was that kind of a guy. And he loved kids, and he loved me, and that's how I feel about it.
Ben Pine was born on September 10, 1883, in Ballorem, a barren fishing village on the south coast of Newfoundland. When he was 10 years old, he made his way to Gloucester, where his entire life would be in one way or the other bound to the sea. He worked around dory fishing schooners for a time, but early on he realized he was cut out for other things. Beginning as a harbor junk peddler, Pine found, bought, and traded fishing gear needed by the captains and crews who were perpetually entering and leaving Gloucester Harbor.
It took him 20 years. He started out as a businessman and rowing from one vessel to the other in the harbor, buying junk and buying cordage and leads and so forth and so on. He parlayed that into a successful outfitting company and vessel management company.
His business grew, and by 1922 led to the forming of the Atlantic Maritime Company at 33 Rogers Street, across from where the Cape Ann Savings Bank is today. Atlantic Maritime outfitted mackerel seiners, dory trawlers, swordfishmen, and eventually diesel-powered draggers. Ben became financially involved by owning shares in many of these vessels and was usually the designated manager of vessels operating from his Atlantic Maritime wharf. Piney, as he was known, was a man of many talents. He was a great friend, teacher, and mentor to many of the boat captains and crew members. He was unmatched as a promoter, bringing all kinds of media attention to Gloucester and to the New England fisheries. And his skill at the helm of a schooner was legendary. The same could be said of his generosity.
There's a long history associated with the schooner races. It goes way back to the early 1900s. And of course, the rivalry was intense when fishing on the banks because the Nova Scotian vessels only had to travel out 50, 60 miles, and they were on the fishing banks. The Gloucester vessels had to travel 300, 400, 500 miles, 1,000 miles to get to the Grand Banks. So they needed to be sleeker and faster in comparison because they had to make market. When the competition started up, these same Canadians in Gloucester, now newly minted U.S. citizens, were really sailing in competition against their uncles and fathers and grandfathers down in Nova Scotia. So it was like one big family, except for the competitive part, and they weren't to be outdone in Nova Scotia by any of their grandsons or sons in the United States.
The International Fishermen's Races started formally in October of 1920. The Halifax Herald challenged Gloucester's fishermen to a race between our nation's fastest schooner to be selected and their recognized Canadian champion, the Delawana. The rules stipulated the boats would be powered by wind alone. Auxiliary engines could not be aboard.
By that time, the diesel engine and power had entered the fleet as early as 1900 in the Helen Miller Gould, who had a 150 horsepower Globe engine installed. So by 1920, many vessels had installed auxiliary power. There were few all-sailing vessels, schooners, to compete in this race and this invitation that was extended by the Halifax Herald. Just about that time, in October, the Esperanto, a vessel built in Essex in 1906, designed by Thomas F. McManus, was coming in from a salt fish trip. She was an all-sail vessel with no auxiliary engine, and she had a reputation of being a flying fisherman.
Extensive repairs and a glistening paint job were hastily performed, and on October 25th, Esperanto proudly sailed for Halifax, Nova Scotia, as thousands of Gloucesterites lined the wharves. Captain Marty Welch was in command of a hand-picked crew of some of the most able men out of Gloucester. Esperanto won both races, a $4,000 cash purse, and the first International Fisherman's Trophy.
And the Dennis Cup from the Mr. Dennis of the Halifax Herald was stowed in the fish hole, and the Gloucester vessel Esperanto left with a brand new broom lashed to her masthead and the fore topmast, and she was bound for Gloucester. When she arrived at the telegraph office on the corner of Middle Street and Pleasant Street, still standing, the ticket tape was up above, and my dad told me 100, 200 people were outside. Traffic couldn't get up and down Pleasant Street, horse and teams in those days, because of the crowd that was gathered outside of the telegraph office. It was a grand and glorious time. That started it all. The next year, the Esperanto went aground on Sable Island Bar, the Northwest Bar, and she was a total loss. The Nova Scotians, recognizing that they needed a faster vessel, designed and built the famous Bluenose. Gloucester was without a contender.
Angus J. Walters of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, had been a fisherman since the age of 14 and a schooner captain at 23. He gained local fame for the speed at which he could bring a boatload of fish to market. Having missed the first international schooner race in 1920 after breaking a mast in a qualifying race, he was game to compete. Walters was a Freemason, as were members of the newly formed race committee. They had commissioned Halifax marine architect William J. Rue to design an ultimate schooner specifically for the purpose of winning the international races. They asked Angus Walters to be its captain, and the Bluenose would become the most famous ship in Canadian history, its image engraved on every Canadian dime since 1937. With the sinking of the Esperanto just a few months prior, the Bluenose easily won its first competition against Gloucester's replacement, the smaller Elsie, in 1921. The following year saw the Henry Ford go up against the Bluenose and lose on a technicality, putting Gloucester in a rage, as it had been apparent that the Ford had outsailed the Bluenose.
Along came a vessel called the Puritan, designed for racing, probably the fastest vessel that ever sailed from the city of Gloucester.
Ben Pine had risen to prominence among the Canadian-born fishermen who dominated the Gloucester waterfront in the 1920s. Pine's relationship with the Puritan was aptly described by Mark de Villiers in his 2009 book, Witch in the Wind. The public face of the Puritan was a well-known Gloucester fishing skipper, Jeff Thomas. But the real driving force was Ben Pine, a Newfoundlander who had built a Gloucester junk business into a formidable fishing fleet. Pine was a bluff man with equal amounts of charm and ruthlessness. He was known for his charity to indigent seamen and lost boys on the wharves of his adopted city, but also as a man who didn't scruple to bankrupt his opponents. But he loved the life and was caught up in the romance of the races.
The vessel lasted just 3 months. She was so fast that in the fog he overshot his mark, and the vessel went ashore on the northwest bar of Sable Island, across the bar into the ocean beyond, and a total loss. Now what to do? What should they do? Well, time went on, and finally they built the Columbia. Just a shade smaller, a few feet shorter than the famous Puritan. She was the last salt banker dory trawler to be launched out of Essex without auxiliary power. She did not have a shaft log. She did not have any provision for having diesel power installed. She was a total, authentic, sail-carrying schooner, designed with the fishermen's races in mind. Ben Pine himself and 4 or 5 other businessmen, and they put together the money. Of all the vessels that Ben Pine owned and managed over the years, maybe 50, maybe even 75, very few of those vessels did he own outright. He always had shares in seed money. He was the one that secured the financing, but he did it with many others. His money was not always at risk.
The Columbia easily won the qualifying rounds off Gloucester to compete in the 1926 race, and made it to Halifax just in time to begin the competition. The 2 boats and crew were so evenly matched, the Bluenose beat the Columbia by only 50 seconds in the first race, and by 90 seconds in the second race. But the race committee gave Columbia the second round, as the Bluenose passed a buoy on the wrong side, a rule that had been instituted the night before. Angus Walters, claiming not to have known about the rule change, was never one to appreciate fussy race rules. To him, the whole point of a race was to be first across the finish line. Incensed with losing by a technicality, he declined to race the third round. With the Bluenose now disqualified, the race committee told Ben Pine if he sailed the third race himself, he could take home the cup. Ben's answer is the stuff of legend. "I came here to race the Bluenose," he said, "not to go for a sail." And with that, he returned to Gloucester without the prize. With the race forfeit by both sides, the purse was split in half, and the Bluenose remained undefeated.
Angus Walters was a cantankerous old fuddy-duddy. He was a poor loser, if anything else, and he would walk away. Ben Pine was a sportsman. They had a rivalry, and Ben Pine was right there when the time came to fight over every inch of waterway that they competed against. Angus Walters was a grumpy guy, but he was a great fisherman, and he was an even greater sail handler, and he had probably the best boat that ever sailed the Atlantic in international fishermen's races. Ben Pine considered the Columbia the finest piece of wood that ever sailed around Eastern Point. It's the Columbia image that's on his tombstone in Oak Grove Cemetery in Gloucester, facing Washington Street for all to see. The Columbia was really his pride and joy. Unfortunately, the Columbia was sunk August 24th in 1927 in the Great August Gale, when 8 or 10 Nova Scotian vessels and the Columbia were anchored off of Sable Island, and a hurricane came down, and all these vessels were lost. The Columbia went down with all hands, including a 17-year-old young boy. So here we are without a contender. This is in 1927. 2 years went by, and Piney conceived the idea of the Gertrude L. Thebaud.
When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Gloucester's last great challenger was being constructed in the Essex shipyard. Having been financed by a syndicate that included the New Jersey millionaire and Eastern Point resident Louis A. Thebaud, the Gertrude L. Thebaud was locally considered a harbinger of good fortune. Designed by the Bostonian naval architect Frank Payne, she was built and outfitted at a cost of nearly $80,000, making her the most expensive fishing schooner ever made, although clearly her sole purpose was to win races.
Ben Pine convinced a half a dozen processing firms, men prominent in the fishing industry, to contribute $5,000 apiece. With that seed money, he went to Louis A. Thebaud. He himself was in the stock market and probably suffered great losses during the 1929 crash, but he was a racing enthusiast, and he convinced Thebaud to invest $40,000 in a new vessel. His wife, Gertrude L., contributed $10,000. On March 17, 1930, the Gertrude L. Thebaud was launched with great fanfare in Essex. This vessel, while she had to be a bona fide fisherman, was really built to be an international contender and take the cup away from the Bluenose.
She was launched in time to qualify for the 1930 Lipton Cup races off Gloucester, which the media-savvy Pine helped cook up as part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's 300th anniversary celebration. The Bluenose, showing her age, lost the first round and was leading in the second race when the weather worsened, causing the race to be canceled for lack of visibility. Angus was furious with the race committee. On the next attempt a few days later, he made a rare navigational error, allowing the Thebaud to take the prize. Angus took personal responsibility for the loss, but would not allow blame to sully the Bluenose, saying, "The Thebaud didn't beat Bluenose, she beat me." As this was not an official race between the U.S. and Canada, the loss meant nothing to the Lunenburgers, who continued to claim the Bluenose was undefeated. By 1937, the popularity of the MGM film Captains Courageous would put Gloucester in the spotlight as the nation embraced the film's nostalgic and overly sentimental view of schooners and dory boat fishing. Eager to capitalize on this, the Master Mariners Association sent Ben Pine to Halifax to renew the International Fishermen's Races, this time as a best-in-5 challenge off Boston and Gloucester. To Angus Walters, by now in his 50s, it was a hard sell. He wanted to move on from fishing. Besides, his wife had died, and he was getting ready to marry a former Halifax barmaid still in her 20s. The Bluenose was 18 years old and again would need at least $10,000 worth of rehabbing. Ben Pine leaned on Boston friends and raised $8,000. This turned out to be enough to motivate Nova Scotians to come up with the rest. On October 6th, the Bluenose docked in Gloucester. On board were 40 tons of ballast in the form of pig iron bars, which would be used to compensate for the weight of the engines, blocking, shafts, and bearings after removal. Once in Gloucester, each race boat was trimmed by adding or removing ballast so their water lines met the approval of the race committee. Once the water lines were approved, no ballast could be added or reduced until the final race was over. Depending on wind conditions, more or less weight could allow the Bluenose to handle better, so not being fond of race committee regulations, Walters quietly moved iron in and out of the schooner in the dead of night, depending on conditions predicted for race day. Sensing this might be the case, Ben Pine's partner, Miss Ray Adams, never one to mess with, hired a security guard to discreetly monitor the wharf overnight. She ultimately caught them red-handed, and the details hit the papers. Amazingly, the race committee decided not to penalize the Bluenose. They were probably worried Walters would sail away in a huff, as he had been bitterly complaining about the conduct of the race committee for weeks. They also weren't ready to squander the media frenzy, which had built up the match to Herculean proportions. And so it was that the Gertrude L. Thebaud and the Bluenose each took 2 races and were tied, when the 5th and final race was held that October of 1938. It was finally the moment that Gloucester had been waiting for since 1921. A health flare-up put Ben Pine in the hospital after the second race.
He turned the command over to his best friend, Captain Cecil Moulton, and it was Cecil Moulton that competed with the Bluenose in the remaining races, and the Bluenose won.
18-year-old masked headsman and future Hollywood movie star Sterling Hayden worked high aloft and distinguished himself by inching out on a spar to secure a loose block, a deed described as heroic in the following day's newspaper accounts. In breezes that Ben Pine complained were so light you could have paddled a canoe around the course, the Bluenose won the final race by less than 3 minutes after sailing 35.5 miles. Insults were thrown from both sides. Moulton cited the illegal movement of the ballast. Angus complained the Thebaud carried too much sail. Both crews complained about the lack of wind, but when the time came to present the Halifax Cup, it was nowhere to be found. Days later, it showed up at an orphanage, the New England Home for Little Wanderers, with a poem attached. It read,
"Here's to Angus, good old sport, whose challenge sort of takes us short. Send us a gale that blows at 30, and we'd bet our shirts on little Gertie."
It is perhaps sad that races intended to be a test of skill and goodwill between the nations ultimately accomplished neither of those things. But although the Halifax Cup would continue to live in Lunenburg, Gloucester would forever cherish those 2 races when their beloved Gertie left Angus Walters and the mighty Bluenose in its wake. The last 3 working dory trawler schooners were the Marjorie Parker, the Shamrock, and the Adventure. Built in the mid-1920s, these vessels lingered on until the early 1950s. The last of these was the Adventure. Launched from the James Yard in Essex, Mass. On September 16, 1926, the Adventure was a Thomas F. McManus-designed knockabout schooner, so called due to McManus's innovation of eliminating the bowsprit. Measuring 122 feet in length, she was first owned and operated out of Gloucester by Captain Jeff Thomas, who had sailed the Puritan in 1922. Thomas tragically suffered a fatal heart attack at the wheel only a few years later. By 1930, the vessel was sold to Boston interests, and for her remaining career she fished out of Boston under Captain Leo Hines. By this time, Boston was the center of the New England groundfish business. This was due to its large steam and diesel-powered beam trawler fleet and its proximity to the fresh fish consumer markets. Adventure landed nearly 4 million pounds worth of groundfish during a successful career, which ended near the end of 1953, as there just weren't the number of experienced crew members available to keep her going.
Now, if ever you wanted to understand why dory fishing was over in 1925 when the diesel engine came in, You only had to go aboard the Adventure on a cold February day, and the engineer, Fred Thomas, jingled up the engine, and we were bound out of Boston Fish Pier on our way to Browns Bank. And 27 men were aboard that vessel. 12 double dories, 2 men in each dory. 24 men went over the side and fished. The engineer, the cook, and Captain Leo Hines were aboard the vessel, along with yours truly. In 1951, the captain was 50 years old. 2 other men, the mate and 1 other man, were in their 50s. The rest, 24 men, were all 65 and over. These were old men. They were tired, they were worn out, and they were in a labor-intensive fishery. The work started on the Adventure long before she sailed from the fish pier in 1951. The ice was taken, 5,000 pounds of mackerel, frozen mackerel bait were loaded aboard in 40-pound cardboard cartons. The grub was stowed below in the fish hole. There was so much food that it required not only the refrigerator in the forecastle, but the wing pens in the fish hole to store the food for the cook to do his business in the forecastle. 4 meals a day. There wasn't one man that wasn't at work, and the work continued for the next 8 days around the clock, with the exception of when we all laid to, when a gale of wind passed by 4 days into the trip. This business was over and done with in 1925, but the old men that participated or continued on in the industry in 2 or 3 vessels, those old men refused to change, and it was their life and their work, and it's what they did. But I'll tell you, contrast that with a dragger crew, and there's no comparison. Because you see, a dragger crew to begin with, there's only 10 men, 12 at the very most. As soon as they take ice and leave the wharf, the watch is set, or the engineers on duty down below, but 7 or 8 men of those 10 all turn in, play cards, and dole away their time until they reach the fishing grounds. Once they got to the Grand Banks in a vessel like the Felicia, it only took them 2.5 days to fill the vessel up. 250,000 pounds of redfish were caught in 2 days, 2.5 days. The Adventure was gone 8 days, and we caught a total of 80,000 pounds of fish. So that's the difference. The men worked far less, and they received much more pay. And that spelled doom to the dory trawling industry. It was just a question of when it would end, and it lingered on for another 25 years. But by 1953, it was totally over. The vessels disbanded, the crews went their way, and men retired, and it was the end of an era.
As bad as the Great Depression was, Gloucester and its industry hung in there. Principal vessel suppliers were Essex shipbuilders. Fishing families financed these boats utilizing their life savings. In buying shares in these vessels, they essentially were providing jobs for themselves. The success of these investments depended entirely upon their work ethic. The 1930s saw the fleet fully transition from sail to diesel power. Dragging greatly increased the volume and frequency of fish landed. Fish were everywhere, from Ipswich Bay to the Gulf of Maine, from George's Bank to the Grand Banks and beyond. As the highliner Captain Lloyd Campbell of the Hilda Garson exclaimed,
"The redfish was eating the keel out of the boat."
Gloucester was on the threshold of a golden age, and by the middle of 1945, grammar school textbooks would recognize Gloucester as the world's leading fishing port.